Hello, everyone, and welcome to Setting History Straight. And we have Carl Dillenback with us tonight. And our program's going to be about the miracles that occurred in the War of 1812. And this is the bicentennial year for the War of 1812. Now, if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, we covered the miracles that happened during the American Revolution. And I just want to make a few comments here. Many people believe that the War of 1812 and the American Revolution was won based on our military strength, and that could not be further from the truth. Now, Carl's going to tell us that tonight. We won both these wars based on God's intervention. It had nothing to do with our military power and strength. Now, Carl's going to tell us about how God intervened in both these wars. Now, the truth of the matter is that we had lost both these wars. Isn't that true, Carl? That's basically what had happened. We had lost both these wars, but it was God's intervention that caused us to have victory in both these battles. But through God's intervention and supernatural events, we came out as the victors. Now, it's really interesting how the historians today have left this information out, and people have no idea today that both wars, the American Revolution and the War of 1812, were won through God's intervention. We had basically lost both these wars. That's exactly what had happened. We had lost both these wars. Both these battles were like Gideon all over again. And that's why we do these series, so we could show people the true history. The truth is we had lost both these wars. Now, we did the program a few weeks ago about the miracles that happened during the American Revolution. Now, if you have not heard that program, you might want to go back and hear it. It should be out on my webpage, which is 12tribehistory.com. Now, if you haven't heard that program, you might want to go back and hear it. But the truth of the matter is that God has been with this nation throughout the centuries, and He's been with these people throughout the centuries. But the secularists have left this information out. And tonight we want to cover this information. So I'm going to turn this program over to Carl and let him explain to you about the War of 1812.
Well, hello, Linda. Thank you so much for having me as a guest speaker again on Setting History Straight. The last time we talked about how the American Revolution was actually won by forces outside of the muscle in our own arm. We certainly did not have the ability to defeat the British. And yet God intervened on a bevy of different occasions. But after the war, as Israel always does, they managed to just accelerate at an enormous rate of speed. We excelled in seafaring mercantile. Our industries boomed. The westward expansion and the tin industry and timber just exploded. We acquired vast territories that were in incredible land reaches in a very, very short period of time. In fact, one of those big land purchases was the Louisiana Purchase, which we bought from Napoleon in 1803. In 1803, was having trouble with his war effort with Britain, and in order to raise money, he sold it to us at a bargain basement price. So this was all being watched very carefully from the throne room in Great Britain. King George III was still on the throne during the time of the War of 1812. He and his people over there had determined that, well, they had just ended that war too quickly, and that they had given up all of this potential resource that they would have been able to keep. All of this would have been theirs, and it wouldn't have cost them a penny if they hadn't given it up so quickly after the war, the Revolutionary War. And that fostered a great deal of jealousy. But as the years went by, Britain began to devise a plan whereby they would goad the United States into a war that they could not possibly win. And then when they had defeated us, they would take us back as a conquered nation this time. All of this property would belong to them. It was not lost on these people at all that if Britain had held on to the colonies, the entire Louisiana Purchase would have belonged to them, and it wouldn't have cost Britain a farthing. Nothing. And all of that land would have been theirs. But so in order to foster this future plan that they had for America, the first thing they did was they started reneging on their treaties. They had agreed that all lands below the Canadian line were the property or the purview of the United States. And then they said, oh, no, we meant the Ohio River. And well, what? What do you mean the Ohio River? Well, I said, well, okay, the Mississippi River, but no farther than that. Everything west of that belongs to Great Britain. That was never in the treaty. That's number one. Biggest problem that we had with Britain was the impressment of American sailors into the British Navy. I want to stop and talk about that for a minute because that's an easy word to just fly over. Impression into the British Navy was slavery for life. You didn't do just a 4-year enlistment. You were in the Royal Navy for life. And I'm telling you, that life of yours wasn't very long. Because number one, you could never get shore leave. They didn't trust you to put you ashore someplace so that you could go out and see your family or something and then trust you to come back to the ship. So you were passed around from ship to ship, from boat to boat for the remainder of your life, which really wasn't very long because if you didn't succumb to the harsh British rules and regulations, which meant you could be hanged for almost anything, you could be beaten with a cat of nine tails for almost anything. And they had a couple of really neat punishments, which involved being whipped around the fleet. And what that meant was they would give you 20 lashes on board your mothership, and then they would pass you to the next ship where they would give you 20 lashes. And they would pass you to the next ship, which gave you 20 lashes. And you went on from ship to ship to ship like that until you died. That was it. It was a death sentence. Another death sentence was a thing called keel hauling, which they did with great frequency. And that is, you took a man and you tied a rope around his waist, and then you threw him over the bow of the ship and dragged him along the keel of the ship, which was loaded with barnacles and crustaceans and sharp things of every imaginable. And you were dragged along the back of that ship to the stern. And of course, once you started to bleed and there was blood in the water, well, there wasn't much left of you when you got pulled up at the stern of the ship. And you got to remember, some of those ships were like 500 feet long. It was an outrage, an absolute outrage. And it continued from the time of the Barbary pirates in 1800 all the way up through and was one of the main points of the war. We were just treated as though we were nothing more than a belligerent colony and that we had no rights, and the British naval and British army could do with us what they wanted. They had stirred up the Indians out in the west, the Shawnee in particular, but not to mention the Hurons and other Indian tribes. And those people were raiding our settlements and murdering our citizens, torturing and killing, burning our fortifications. And when we would complain, they would fall on deaf ears. They never stopped. And there was British military forays into south of the Great Lakes all the time. It was an intolerable situation. Really, in 1812, you have to say, well, what are we going to do about it? I mean, we were this little itty-bitty nation, and they were this great big country. And they were, at that time, mopping up Napoleon and his armies in Europe. And that was a problem, too, because we were, by most standards, really a seafaring mercantile nation. That is, we sold our goods with our ships to different countries for a profit, what was good for our country. Now, if we could sell textile and furniture to France, we would do it. We could sell the same thing to Britain, we would do that. Problem is, the French and the British both thought of us as the de facto ally of the other nation. So we fought a brief war with France over that issue. They were boarding our ships and they were confiscating our goods. Well, the British were doing the same thing. They were not only taking ships bound for France, the goods were confiscated, the ships were confiscated, and the crews were all impressed into the British Navy. This was just intolerable. But again, I have to ask the question, what were we going to do about it? But in reality, what are you going to do about it? Well, being the people we are, we took it, and then finally we weren't going to take it anymore. So, in 1812, we declared war against Great Britain, and everybody thought we were out of our ever-loving minds. This is crazy. We don't have a chance against these people. And this is exactly what Britain wanted. They were all ready for it, because before we could get messages to the settlers and the military out in Michigan and Illinois, those settlements and those forts were attacked. People were slaughtered. The British were just waiting to jump over the line the minute the orders came through. The incursions that were made by this country into Canada were in response to open invasion of our borders, which occurred first. Now, I'm not going to say that we wouldn't have been very, very happy with a Canadian uprising that would have kicked the British out. A lot of Canadians supported that. In fact, during the war, at the Battle of Chrysler's Farm, we had a large contingent of Canadians on our side, and they had come to fight the British. But when fellow Canadians showed up, they refused to fire on them. There were a lot of Canadians that supported our cause in that war. Anyway, the idea of American aggression wanting to conquer Canada is just a fantasy. At any rate, the war was started, and right from the get-go, we started losing. We couldn't win a battle to save our life. We lost Fort Dearborn. We lost what later became Detroit. Later became Chicago. And these were atrocities, because the Indians at Chicago offered the settlers fair passage out. And when they walked outside the fort, they slaughtered them. Men, women, children, everybody. It was a terrible ordeal. Most of our sea battles during the second year, we didn't do too badly, actually. There's Perry on Lake Erie and John Paul Jones and his victories over ships that were out in the Atlantic Ocean. But by and large, we just lost. We got over onto the shores of Canada. We were defeated badly at Chrysler's Farm and Lindy Lane. And it looked like we were going to lose the war. In fact, as time went by, it just got more and more obvious that we were going to lose this war. And we just could not defeat these people. There was too many of them. Of course, the British also incited the Indians. And the Indians got into the war mostly through the efforts of a fellow by the name of Tecumseh. And Tecumseh was a Shawnee chief and a brilliant man. He was able to use his influence among the Shawnees all the way down to Alabama, to the Creek Nation, particularly the Red Stick Creeks, who were cousins to the Shawnee. He incited them, and so the war was waged down in the South while it was being waged up along the Canadian border. And there was a fellow by the name of Cochrane who commanded the British fleet along the Atlantic seaboard, and he just blockaded. We were blockaded. He raided towns at will. He had forays into Long Island, coast of Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts. You couldn't get a ship out. He would come in and he would burn towns like Stony Creek in Connecticut, was burned to the ground. Well, the war went on, and it didn't look like there was going to be any chance of even being able to negotiate a peace. And in fact, some people did try to negotiate a separate peace with Great Britain. One of them was the governor of Vermont. His name is Chittenden. He attempted to negotiate a peace, but people wouldn't have it. The Vermonters were tough, and they were independent, and there was no way. Although there was trading going on with Britain and Canada, so much so, the borders were so porous, you wouldn't think there was a war going on. But there was. The War of 1812 existed. There was bravery and heroism on an unprecedented scale that existed right along beside cowardice and treason on an unprecedented scale. Great many of the merchants were trading with Britain and against our own best interests. There were a lot of people who were outspoken opponents of the war. It was a very, very unpopular war, and I can understand why. By 1813, the nation was in a state of panic. Banks were being robbed by British incursion troops on the East Coast. The money wasn't safe. The property wasn't safe. Nothing was safe. Everybody was just sitting around waiting for the coup de grace, for them to finish us off. Well, from June 1812 until August of 1814, quite frankly, we had lost the war. By the summer of 1814, it was all over. Outside of a few minor victories, we just had no hope of winning that war. It was all over. And what that meant was this. We would have had to have signed an unconditional surrender with Great Britain. Great Britain would have come in here. They would have taken our nation away from us, our freedom away from us, our government would have been gone. We would have been right back underneath the heel of the British Crown, but this time as a conquered nation. All the territory that we had, Canada, all of the Western territories out through the Mississippi River would have all belonged to Great Britain, and they wanted it. So they were really kind of chafing at the bit. They had devised a plan to conquer this country, which was kind of a coup de grace. This plan was on the drawing boards, mind you, before the war began. So this was their intention all along. After they had defeated Napoleon, that released tens of thousands of British troops into the theater and into the American war. Now, 14,000 of those troops went to Montreal. Another 15,000 went to Cochrane's fleet for an invasion in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. The rest of the men, which was another 15 to 18,000 men, were whisked away to a secret base in the north. They were to strike down through the state of New York, through the village of Plattsburgh, down to Glens Falls, then to Albany, which would give them control of Lake Champlain. From there, they could go down the Hudson River into New York, cut New York off from the rest of the country. There would be no supplies coming in. There would be no troops coming from to aid them. They would just be laid under siege and starved out. A victory in New York would split the United States in two. It would split New England from the rest of the country. And New England would have to sue for peace. Okay. The reason New York would get no help is because of a foothold incursion into this country through Washington and Baltimore. The idea was to land troops in Washington, take the city, destroy the government, or send them into exile, make them completely ineffective, and then move forth into Baltimore, take Baltimore, and then just the third part of this dastardly plan was to come through the southern underbelly at New Orleans, take New Orleans, and then the whole southern underbelly of this country, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, everything goes. The only thing that would be left open would be Spain, Spanish Florida, because at that time, Florida belonged to Spain. All right? But there we are. This is an incredible situation, an impossible one. We were a defeated nation. How were we going to survive this kind of an onslaught with the greatest navy in the world and greatest army in the world and the most experienced soldiers and the most experienced sailors that had fought under Wellington and Lord Nelson, and they were headed our way? We didn't stand a chance. There was not a prayer. By August of 1814, we had lost the war. By the middle of September of that same year, 1814, we had won the war. How in the world did this happen? The story is absolutely incredible. Okay. I've often said that the War of 1812 was won by a hurricane, a tornado, a swollen river, a wind change, and a fog. And that is how we won this war. It wasn't by our own hand. And it is the reason I believe that the War of 1812 has been so maligned by so many secular historians. Even the British soldiers knew that they were on the wrong side of this one. And American secularists have tried to poo-poo it from that day till this. So much so that we're in the bicentennial of the War of 1812, and what have we done? Celebrations have there been. I'm going to tell you what happened, because this is one of the greatest stories in American history that's ever been told. And it's been just shoved underneath the rug for 200 years. Well, not anymore. August of 1814, Lord Cochrane, Commodore Cochrane, invades Washington. Okay, we all know about what happened in Washington. Washington was attacked, and it was burned to the ground, and the army was put into flight. But there's actually more than that. This was a shameful period in our history. We outnumbered them. They only had 1,500 men. We had at least 1,000 more than they had. Plus, we had an armed citizenry. We had everything going for us. We could have repelled it. But because of pure cowardice, there's no other way to describe it. Instead of standing and stopping the British invasion, everybody ran. Everybody ran. They got out of the city. They grabbed their money. They grabbed what they could grab, and they left, leaving President Madison all by himself. Dolly Madison is credited with just saving a lot of the important things from the White House, the art, and a lot of things that we enjoy today, including, by the way, the original copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. We owe that to Dolly Madison. Otherwise, the British would have burned it, as they did everything else. And they got out entirely by the efforts of one band of sailors. There were, I think there was 25 of them. And they held the British street by street, alley by alley, backing up while everybody was running out of the city. The British were coming in, and they were burning as they came. And this band of soldiers, who I know very little about, and neither does anybody else. I don't know who commanded them or anything else, because they were all killed. Every one of them, they sold their lives dearly, protect people and the city. British come in, they burn the presidential mansion, they burn all our buildings, they destroy everything they can destroy, property, and they set up a foothold in Washington. Then they move on Baltimore. As they're moving on Baltimore and attacking Fort William Henry at the same time, an incredible thing happens. While they're in the open, the entire British Army under General Ross, in the open, they get hit with a hurricane. A hurricane just comes up on them suddenly. Now, the hurricane did a number of things. For one thing, it put out the fires in Washington. Number two, it took Cochrane's fleet and threw them around like a bunch of toy boats in a bathtub. It just slammed them every which way or another. So they couldn't get a steady shot at Fort William Henry because the ships couldn't hold their keels level enough to get the broadsides onto the fort. Not only that, something else very interesting happened. There's a thing called hot shot. And hot shot are huge iron balls that are hollowed out and filled with powder. And they're lighted with a fuse, and they're set off by a mortar. And the object is that these things can be lobbed over a wall and into the inside of a fort, and where they explode and send iron everywhere in all directions. Incredible destruction. Well, one of those hotshot huge balls, over 8 feet in diameter, went over the fort wall at Fort William Henry and rolled up against the door to the powder magazine. Yeah, it would have destroyed the fort. It would have killed most of the soldiers in it, which, by the way, also included their wives and children. But it fizzled out. It did not explode. It just sat there like a big lump. Meanwhile, as Ross is still trudging his way through the hurricane, which is just absolutely destroying his army, he has to hunker down till the whole thing blows over. Another incredible thing happens. The hurricane spawns a tornado, and the tornado comes down in the center of the British Army. Just absolutely havoc and confusion and death and destruction everywhere. This thing came right down in the middle of the British Army, and I'm here to tell you, they knew that they were on the wrong side of history when this happened. There was no ifing, anding, or butting about what they were doing was wrong and they were in the wrong country, fighting the wrong people, and that God was displeased. Most of these people were very religious people. They understood God. This 1, 2, 3 punch was just more than they could just whisk away. Well, to make a long story short, all of this was a great morale builder to the American. General Ross was killed, and the British Army just raced to the ships. And what was left of Cochrane's fleet moved out, and that whole center thrust into the United States fizzled into nothing. But that's not the end of the story. Okay? We had known and expected for the entirety of the war, really, that we could expect an invasion from Canada through Montreal, down through the Champlain Valley, down Lake Champlain. There was a little village called Plattsburgh, which was located on the northern frontier, about 30 miles south of the Canadian line. It was a fishing village that had been invaded and destroyed by the British in 1813, burned to the ground. So the British didn't think this was going to be any problem at all. This was a no-brainer. 14,000 troops strong, they come across the Canadian border under the command of the Canadian Governor-General, Sir George Prevost. And these are all, if I'm pronouncing that right, peninsular veterans from the Napoleonic Wars. These guys are all hardened combat troops and Canadian soldiers that are with them, many of them from the beginning of the war. They marched over the line. Interestingly enough, and the story of Gideon comes to mind, there were originally, in July, there were 8,000 troops in Plattsburgh waiting for him. In August, General Izard, who was the commanding general, received orders that he was to take his army and head for the Niagara frontier to aid in the defense of that theater, which left Plattsburgh in the hands of a 30-year-old artillery officer who had just recently been promoted to brigadier general. His name was Alexander Macomb. And they left him with 1,500 green troops and General Izard's wounded and sick. The ones that had pneumonia, the ones that couldn't work, the ones that were in bad shape. He left the hospitals full with them and took the rest of the army and left Plattsburgh. And he left Plattsburgh about the same time that the British were getting shellacked in Washington, at the end of August. Well, now, there's General Macomb with 1,500 troops, green troops, by the way. Most of them had never even seen action. And 700 militiamen from the Essex County Militia and the Clinton County Militia, plus volunteers that have been coming over from Vermont under General Strong. The total defense of the village of Plattsburgh was 4,500 men, militia and regulars, against 14,000 troops coming at them from across the border. Well, the British did come over the border, and they came down, and they set up shop in a little town called Chazy, which is about 12 miles outside of Plattsburgh. Now, General Macomb set up all his defenses on the south side of the Saranac River. Now, for those of you who have never been in that area, the Saranac River is barely a river. It's maybe 40 yards wide, and in September, you can see the rocks in the bottom. It's more like a creek than a river, and that was all that separated the Americans from the British. However, they'd had 2 weeks of solid on and off rain, and it swelled the Saranac River to the point where it was chest high, and the current was vicious. So it made a formidable barricade between the American troops and the British forces. All right. On the lake, there were a very small fleet commanded by another 30-year-old, Thomas McDonough, who had a great deal of naval experience. He had fought the Barbary pirates, and he had been in several incidents with the British, and he was no slouch when it came to naval command. In fact, when he was posted at Lake Champlain and Plattsburgh, he had no navy, no ships, no sailors, no guns, no equipment, no cannon, no powder, no anything. And this was in 1830. In less than 2 years, he built up a naval school, a naval yard where he built his own ships out of pine boards and pine trees from Vermont. He turned Vermont farm boys into sailors. He turned green militiamen into naval marines capable of firing from rat lines and acting as marines aboard ship. And that takes a lot of training. That's not something you can do in a big. In fact, here you have to learn how to fire and load a musket while you're wrapped around a rat line, and then reload, prime your where the ship is moving, pitching left and right all the time, left and right, up and down, and you've got to be able to load and fire and keep your balance. It's not an easy task being one of these guys. It required a great deal of training. Anyway, so here he is. There was the Saratoga, the Eagle, the Ticonderoga, and the Preble. He had 4 ships, and he had galleys, row galleys. And with these, by the way, the last ship built was the Eagle, and that was finished in July of that year. So you were walking on the ships, and you were slipping on the sap from the trees. They were still green. This was it. He managed to scrounge some cannon from Whitehall, New York, and bring it up there. And these men, these 2 young men were at Macomb was able to fortify the village of Plattsburgh, and Macomb was able to defend the lake. It was an absolutely incredible feat, but they were still outnumbered 6-1. And here comes the British. Well, the only thing they could do was try to slow them up as much as possible. So there were running forays and gun battles, which occurred as they moved south from Chazy, and as they approached the village of Plattsburgh. They tore up all the bridges, pulled everything up, and moved to the other side of the river, which by now was a raging torrent. Very, very unusual for the month of September in that region. You know, anybody that lives in that region knows that your creeks and your rivers are very low, and your creeks, you can see the rocks on them. You know? Okay. Here comes the British naval under the command of George Downing. His fleet twice the size of McDonough. And he has longer range guns. He has twice as many seamen. He has ships going into that lake, which are ocean-going class ships. The Confidence, which was his flagship, was ocean-going size. It was a huge ship for lake warfare. Now, McDonough strung out his ships in a line and anchored to protect the village of Plattsburgh. He was able to pour cannon fire and rifle fire onto the British as they advanced. At the same time, he had to fight this battle from an anchored position in a line. All the ships were in a line. On Sunday morning, September 11th, interesting date, Downey comes around Cumberland Head into the open waters. And why he didn't just lay off out of range of McDonough's guns and just pound the American fleet into toothpicks is something that has baffled historians from that day to this. his guns were capable of firing a mile farther than McDonough's guns were. Here's my offer. First of all, he had the wind in his favor. The wind was favorable. The wind was coming from the north and flowing south, not south, but southeast. Okay, which meant his ships come in close. Number one. Number two, there was an egotistical thing. This is my opinion. I think his ego got the best of him. There was no glory in a victory being won by massacring these American sailors when they couldn't fight back. The glory would be bringing the ships in close, running them along the American line, and then just blasting them with his big gun. And then he'd claim a naval victory for himself and for Britain, laying off and just pounding them to smithereens, which would have been the smart thing to do, but it wouldn't be the glorious thing to do. So he took advantage of the wind, and he came around in close. But I don't know whether he didn't realize it or he just didn't care, because they had really absolute contempt for him. Here's this kid who's acting out like a commodore, and he's got these bunch of green farm boys on his ship acting as sailors and marines on ships that probably would fall apart if you looked at them hard. I mean, they were just brand spanking new, not even painted. Well, anyway, he comes in close, but what he didn't realize was the smaller American guns could be fired 3 times to 1 British gun. Because they were small, they could fire and be loaded. They required a crew of 3, and the British gun, each gun required a crew of 9 to do the job. So the Americans, when the British came in, could outfire them 3-1. So it became quite a contest. And in the process of the contest, Downey was killed when a cannon came flying off its carriage and crushed him. The battle raged for 2.5 hours. It was quite a melee, horrendous melee. Finally, all the serviceable guns on the Saratoga, that's McDonough's flagship, the American ship, were gone. They did not have any cannon to fight with anymore. The only way that they could keep from being annihilated by the British ships, who still had cannon that were operating, was turn the ship around so that the port side batteries, which were not used in the fight, could be brought to bear on the English fleet. Remember, so 3 guys in a small dinghy went out, cut the cable, the bow cable, and tied the rope, because that's the anchor line, tied it off onto the dinghy, and 2 rowed and 1 steered. And the entire British fleet, when they realized what was happening, started shooting at it. The 2 kids, and they were both midshipmen, both of them were 16, 17 years old. Both of them were hit, but they weren't hit bad enough. They kept on rowing. And the sailing master, whose name was Brum, was disrobed by a cannon splinter. All of those people shooting at him were not able to stop him from turning the Saratoga around. And when she turned around, and the British could see that she was going to be able to complete the turn, they tried to turn their own ship so that they could bring a fresh broadside against the Saratoga. And what happened? The wind shifted. All day long, from the early morning on, the winds had favored the British. At the critical moment, when they needed the wind more than at any time during the campaign, the wind shifted. That wind was sent from God, I have no doubt, to bring in, and entered into his mind. He could bring his ships in close because the winds were favorable. He didn't have to sit out and just blow Americans to pieces. He could come in. And he did come in. And then when he needed the wind the most, it failed him. And the sails just sat there flapping away in the breeze. McDonough leveled the broadside. Wow. Meanwhile, on the land, hundreds and hundreds of British soldiers went into that lake into the Saranac River, and they couldn't get across. And they were being slaughtered by the hundreds. Finally, at a point in the battle that they were able to ford at a shallow place upriver, and they finally got across. But they had to fight their way. The Americans were holding, and they held till their backs were against Lake Champlain, and it looked like maybe it was all over, until they received the word that the Americans had won the battle on the lake. At the same time they received the word, the British also received the word that Downey was dead and the British had lost the battle on the lake. Inexplicably, Governor Preble ordered a retreat. When he did that, his entire army fell apart. The Americans came over the barricade and totally destroyed a full division of British soldiers when they got tangled up in the hardwood of that area. And so they were stopped at Plattsburgh by a wind shift and a swollen river. Miracle number 3 and 4. Well, it wasn't over yet. Of course, that ended the war, and negotiations began. But the British didn't give up on the foothold in the South. They still maintained the army in the South. The Treaty of Ghent ending the war was signed on December 24th, 1814. Now, on January 8th, 1815, the British attacked New Orleans. Now, New Orleans has a lot of little tributaries, and the British landed in force. Somehow or another, this fog appeared. A thick pea soup fog in all these little bayous and swamps and marshes and little inlets. They were all obscured, and the ships got separated, got lost in the fog. They finally pulled things together. All right. Now, we were able to be pretty accurate with our fire against British at New Orleans because we had spotters in the fog, and we would set up flares when the British, who were marching, of course, trying to put their formations together. Of course, we all know what happened. They lost that battle miserably. Really turned out to be a slaughter. I think Andrew Jackson lost 8 men and another 13 wounded. Well, that was it. And the British lost over 1,000. It was just a turkey shoot. It was terrible. It was an awful thing. But it was not just a terrible accident. The British had plenty of time to hold off on the invasion till after the peace was negotiated. They did it deliberately so that they would have a foothold in America, and you can bet your bottom dollar. And this whole thing would have gone on for a lot longer. Bare minimum, they would have laid claim to the Louisiana Purchase and all Western territories. We did win a great victory. This nation owes its life to the War of 1812. And to men like Andrew Jackson, like James and Dolly Madison, like Tom McDonough, and Alexander Macomb, and people like that who, for the most part, have been relegated to the back pages of U.S. history. Some of whom you don't even know. Anyway, I wrote a book on this subject. If you're all interested, and if this sort of thing means anything to you, by the end of July of this year, if you're interested, we should have a greater reverence for this particular battle than we will, because this was so obvious that God had intervened. It was just like Gideon. Again, we were the mouse that roared, and we owe our very existence to God, and here we are today turning our back on him. That's all I have to say, and thank you so much for bearing with us, and I hope you enjoyed this program.
Thank you, Carl, for sharing this information with us. And now we have the whole story. It's certainly not what you hear from historians today, and we just need to understand that God was all over the War of 1812, and the story that we're told today by the historians is just not correct. They leave out the miracles that happened in the War of 1812. Now, with that, we're going to close for tonight. We're going to say blessings to all and good night.
Bye-bye.